Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs will come to order. There are a few people still on the way that are close. I will forego my opening statement and request unanimous consent to be entered into the record. I also request unanimous consent that support letters from national security professionals, housing, family advocates, industry organizations, others being placed in the record without objection. So ordered. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will forego an opening statement and simply ask for unanimous consent that it be submitted in writing.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. We will begin in this order. We'll proceed to the vote on the nomination of Graham Steele to serve as Assistant Secretary for Financial Institutions. The clerk will call the roll. Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto? Aye. Ms. Smith? Aye. Ms. Sinema? Aye. Mr. Ossoff?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Warnock? Aye. Mr. Toomey?
No.
Mr. Shelby?
No by proxy.
Mr. Crapo?
Aye.
Mr. Scott?
Aye by proxy.
Okay. Mr. Rounds?
Aye.
Mr. Tillis?
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy?
No by proxy. No by proxy.
Mr. Haggerty?
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis?
No by proxy.
Mr. Moran?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Kramer?
No by proxy.
Mr. Gaines?
No by proxy.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 17-7. Nominees affirmed.
The ayes have it that the nominations hereby ordered reported favorably to the full Senate. As soon as Senator Ossoff is recorded in person as yes. We'll now move to the nomination of Brian Nelson as Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Crimes. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto? Aye. Ms. Smith? Aye. Ms. Sinema? Aye. Mr. Ossoff? Aye. Mr. Warnock? Aye. Mr. Toomey?
No.
Mr. Shelby?
No by proxy.
Mr. Crapo?
No.
Mr. Scott?
No by proxy.
Mr. Rounds?
No.
Mr. Tillis?
No.
Mr. Kennedy?
No by proxy.
Mr. Haggerty?
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis?
No by proxy.
Mr. Moran?
No by proxy.
Mr. Kramer?
No by proxy.
Mr. Daines?
No by proxy.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 12-12. The nominee is tied.
Committee vote having concluded in a tie vote in accordance with Senate Resolution 27, I'll transmit a notice of the tie vote to the Secretary of the Senate in accordance with Section 3 of that resolution, giving the majority or minority leader the authority to move to discharge. We'll now proceed to vote on the nomination of Elizabeth Rosenberg to serve as Treasury Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing. The clerk will call the roll.
Which one? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Reed?
Aye.
Mr. Menendez?
Aye.
Mr. Tester? Mr. Warner?
Aye.
Ms. Warren?
Aye.
Mr. Van Hollen? Ms. Cortez Masto? Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Ms. Sinema?
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff?
Aye.
Mr. Warnock?
Aye.
Mr. Toomey?
No.
Mr. Shelby?
No by proxy.
Mr. Crapo. Mr. Scott.
No by proxy.
Mr. Rounds. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Haggerty.
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis.
No by proxy.
Mr. Moran.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kramer.
No by proxy.
Mr. Daines.
No by proxy.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 12 to 12 tied.
Thank you. I will transmit a notice of the tie vote to the Secretary of the Senate in accordance with Section 3 of that resolution, giving the majority and minority leader the authority to move to discharge the nomination. I now move to favorably report the nomination of Julia Gordon to serve as Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Tester. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Van Hollen. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Smith. Ms. Sinema. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Toomey.
No.
Mr. Shelby.
No by proxy.
Mr. Crapo. Mr. Scott.
No by proxy.
Mr. Rounds. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Haggerty.
No by proxy.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Haggerty.
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis.
No by proxy.
Mr. Moran.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kramer.
No by proxy.
Mr. Daines.
No by proxy.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is tied 12 to 12.
Committee vote having concluded a tie in accordance with Resolution 27, I'll transmit a notice of the tie vote to the Secretary of the Senate in accordance with Section 3 of that resolution, giving the majority-minority leader the authority to move to discharge the nomination. I now move to report favorably the nomination of David Uhio to be Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Tester. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Van Hollen. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Smith. Ms. Sinema. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Toomey.
No.
Mr. Shelby.
No by proxy.
Mr. Crapo. Mr. Scott.
No by proxy.
Mr. Rounds. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Lummis.
No by proxy.
Mr. Moran.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kramer.
No by proxy.
Mr. Daines.
No by proxy.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 12 to 12 tied.
In accordance with Senate Resolution 27, I transmit a notice of the tie vote to the Secretary of the Senate in accordance with Section 3 of that resolution, thereby giving either the majority or minority leader the authority to move to discharge the nomination. I now move to report favorably the nomination of Solomon Green to serve as Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Tester. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Van Hollen. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Smith. Ms. Sinema. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Toomey.
No.
Mr. Shelby.
No by proxy.
Mr. Crapo. Mr. Scott.
No by proxy.
Mr. Rounds. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Lummis.
No by proxy.
Mr. Moran.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kramer.
No by proxy.
Mr. Daines.
No by proxy.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 12 to 12 tied.
The committee vote having concluded a tie in accordance with Resolution 27, I'll transmit a notice of the tie vote to the Secretary of the Senate in accordance with Section 3, thereby giving the majority and minority leader the authority to move to discharge the nomination. We will now proceed to vote by voice in block on the nominations of Alexia Latour II to serve as Assistant Secretary for International Markets, Mr. Alan Estevez to serve as Undersecretary of Commerce for Industry and Security, and Ms. Thea Kendler to serve as Assistant Secretary for Export Administration. I move to report favorably the nominations of the three. All those in favor say aye.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Menendez.
I'd like to be recorded as a no on Mr. Estevez, please.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? The ayes have it. The nominations are approved and reported favorably to the full Senate. Thank you all for your cooperation. The clerk will see to reporting these nominations. I hope we can move them swiftly on the floor. Any senators wishing to make a statement? Thank you all for your cooperation and timeliness. The executive session's concluded. We'll now proceed to the hearing on Afghanistan. We'll take about a 60-second break. Would the witnesses please come to the table? Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs will come to order. This hearing is in a hybrid format. Our witnesses, 3 in person, 1 remote. Members have the option to appear in person or virtually. Everyone who is at the markup is checked in that order. Once you start speaking, there'll be a slight delay before you're displayed on the screen. I think you all know those rules. Speaking order will be as usual, that is by check-in and seniority. So thank you again for all of your cooperation. In August, we finally ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan. 125,000 people were airlifted out of the country in a few short weeks because of the skill and the courage of our troops and our diplomats and humanitarian workers on the ground. Today, our service members are out of harm's way for the first time in 2 decades. Thousands of Afghans are starting a better life in this country. We welcome, as our history suggests, we welcome these refugees seeking freedom. Our country has done that for generations. But in the midst of evacuation, we saw a country in turmoil. An Islamic State suicide bomb attack near the airport killed 13 U.S. troops, scores of innocent Afghan men, women, and children. One of them, Navy Corpsman Max Sobiak of Berlin Heights, about 50 miles from where I live, was among those killed in action, died a hero in service of his country, working to evacuate vulnerable Afghans and protect fellow Americans. Even after the evacuation ended, tens of thousands of special immigrant visa applicants, other vulnerable Afghans remain in Afghanistan, along with many American citizens or legal permanent residents of the U.S., including some of my constituents. It's now clear that the agreement that former President Trump reached with the Taliban, which provided for the final phase of the U.S. withdrawal process and the release of 5,000 battle-hardened Taliban prisoners, was flawed. Many of those released Taliban prisoners contributed to the Taliban's quick seizure of the country. President Biden, understandably reluctant to keep or expand the number of American troops in harm's way while working out a better deal, observed that Trump agreement. It's also clear the Biden administration and U.S. officials failed to anticipate the rapid fall of the Afghan government it's obvious that the execution of the withdrawal was flawed. We also now know, of course, that the Taliban never intended, as they claimed, to pursue a peaceful path, a more democratic path with a broader government with representatives from a diverse race of ethnic groups, gender, and civil society actors. They refused to reject relationships with terrorists like the Haqqani Network and al-Qaeda. 3 different committees chaired by Banking Committee colleagues, Senator Menendez, with Senate Foreign Relations, Senator Warner, with Senate Intelligence, Senator Reid with Armed Services, have begun thorough reviews, including a series of hearings to assess the many decisions, including mistakes, made along the way by subsequent administrations and possibly by Congress over 20 years in Afghanistan. What is clear is that before we send our service members into another conflict, we must make sure that military engagement is truly the last resort and that we know how we will extricate ourselves from military conflicts before we get ourselves into them. Today, the focus of this hearing is to look forward to envision what we can do to address the urgent economic and humanitarian crisis facing the country in the wake of the Taliban takeover, to assess the role of economic and financial sanctions and other counterterrorism tools against the Taliban, tools within this committee's jurisdiction. With as much as 30% unemployment, a brain drain of its most capable young people, enduring deep poverty, an ongoing drought, the COVID crisis, and the collapse of Afghanistan's economy looming, the people of Afghanistan need help. We must consider how the U.S. can maintain the flow of humanitarian assistance and family remittances while ensuring that aid does not fall into the wrong hands. This aid's been a lifeline to the people of Afghanistan. Millions rely on it and must continue even while we deny access to funds to terrorist actors like Haqqani, al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. As we'll hear today, this is no small task, but it's essential. The lives and livelihoods of millions of Afghans may depend on it. We owe them that much. And we must do this while protecting the security of Americans and preventing Afghanistan from once again emerging as a terrorist safe haven. The administration's made clear the Taliban should be judged by their actions over time in any decisions regarding diplomatic recognition or the release of billions in frozen Afghan government reserves is far off. They have a clear-eyed realism about who the Taliban are, while at the same time recognizing, along with our allies, that they control the government and that we must engage them and, when necessary, hold them accountable for abuses. If the last month is any indication, the Taliban are not moderating their positions. They've appointed brutal old guard Taliban members to serve in the interim government, including the leader of the terrorist Haqqani Network as Minister of the Interior. They have threatened, harassed, and attacked women and girls who were demonstrating to retain their hard-fought freedoms. They closed Kabul's premier university to women faculty and to women students. They converted the former Ministry of Women's Affairs into the old notorious Ministry of Vice and Virtue, a pretty awful, grotesque irony. They've harassed, beaten, and killed journalists. They started a return to grisly public executions. They threatened to return to public amputation. The situation grows more dire each day. We know that China, Russia, and other countries that don't share our values are already engaging in Afghanistan. They have few qualms about funds falling into the wrong hands. It's up to us to show the Afghan people and people around the world that the U.S. will continue to be a beacon of hope and a source of humanitarian relief. I'm eager to hear today from our 4 witnesses who will share their unique perspectives with us. We welcome you all to the committee in person and remotely and look forward to your testimony. Senator Toomey, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to welcome our witnesses today. I look forward to hearing from you. Last month, of course, we all watched in horror as chaos unfolded at Kabul's airport. This administration's flawed decisions resulted in a catastrophic evacuation from Afghanistan. Responsibility for this withdrawal, notwithstanding our severely flawed negotiations with the Taliban under the previous administration, lies with President Biden. To be clear, I felt at the time, and I still believe, that it was wrong for the previous administration to negotiate with the Taliban to the exclusion of the legitimately elected Afghan government and to agree to a full withdrawal of U.S. troops. However, at least that agreement was conditioned on the Taliban fulfilling certain political commitments, including achieving a permanent comprehensive ceasefire and agreeing upon a political roadmap for Afghanistan's future. Since it is universally acknowledged that the Taliban failed to live up to those conditions, the Biden administration could have chosen a different path and adjusted their withdrawal plan without even having violated the prior agreement. Tragically, they did not. We know from recent congressional testimony that President Biden ignored the counsel of DoD officials to keep a military presence in the country longer. And we also know from recent media reporting that the DoD urged the administration to begin the evacuation of Americans months earlier. Had the president listened to this advice, America could have ended, not continued as the president claims, but responsibly ended our involvement in this ongoing war on our own terms. Instead, the terms of our chaotic exit were sent by the Taliban, a terrorist group that we've been at war with for 20 years. Amazingly, the administration entrusted the safe passage of Americans, green card holders, and vulnerable Afghans to evacuate the country to the Taliban, and did not publicly question or challenge the Taliban's threats that we must depart by August 31st. So it's no wonder that, contrary to President Biden's assertion that the U.S. would stay until every American was able to leave, in fact, hundreds of American citizens and legal permanent residents were left behind, including Pennsylvanians. One such Pennsylvanian American citizen, a mother of four, works at a middle school in the Lehigh Valley where I live. During the evacuation operations in Kabul, she repeatedly tried and failed to make it to the airport. Once she was tear-gassed. Another time she nearly had her passport seized by a Taliban militant. She was just blocks away when the suicide attack at the airport killed 13 U.S. service members and nearly 200 Afghans. The only way she escaped Afghanistan was because a veterans group operating on the ground found her, protected her, and got her on a flight on September 10th. It is unbelievable to me that a group of American civilians had to save this American woman's life because her own government abandoned her. And now, as a direct result of this humiliating and unnecessary surrender in Afghanistan, a massive humanitarian disaster appears likely to descend on the Afghan people. Today, thousands of Americans, green card holders, and Afghan special immigrant visa applicants who aided the U.S. military and their families are still trying to escape this disaster. And of course, the Afghan people, including vulnerable women, girls, and minorities, now face violence, systemic repression, and the denial of their basic rights under Taliban rule, something that the Afghan people haven't known for 2 decades. Now, the Biden administration has said repeatedly that the Taliban must cut ties with terrorist groups, ensure the rights of women and girls, conduct no revenge killings against our Afghan partners, and allow Americans, green card holders, and civs and their families to leave the country freely. As we will hear today, the Taliban is failing on all of these fronts. They are a brutal, murderous terrorist group intertwined with al-Qaeda. Yet the administration's current posture seems to be based on the naive hope that the Taliban will reform itself now that they've taken power. The administration may feel pressured to provide sanctions relief to the Taliban to address the acute humanitarian crisis that is emerging in Afghanistan. But bestowing international legitimacy on the Taliban and allowing them access to $7.5 billion at the New York Fed would be a grave mistake. We must be exploring ways to help the Afghan people without empowering the Taliban. Today we'll consider critical issues that will determine whether and how the administration will engage with the Taliban, including the status of sanctions on the Taliban, which is a specially designated global terrorist organization now that it controls Afghanistan, the interconnectedness of al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network and the Taliban, and any new sanctions that should be imposed on these groups, the acute risk of Afghanistan becoming an epicenter of money laundering and terrorist financing, Treasury's policies permitting humanitarian aid to continue flowing to the Afghan people, the current and future status of the $7.5 billion in Afghan foreign reserves kept at the New York Fed, and Afghanistan's $500 million in special drawing rights held at the IMF. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about these and other issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Let me take a moment to introduce our witnesses, then we'll turn first to Mr. Smith for his testimony. Adam Smith, former Treasury National Security official, deep expertise in the implementation of enforcement of sanctions and other illicit finance tools, has some creative ideas on how the Biden administration might ease the suffering of Afghans while preserving effective sanctions on the Taliban. Welcome, Mr. Smith. Sue Eckert, former government official, now at the Center for Strategic International Studies, lecturer at Yale University. She's worked for years on sanctions in humanitarian aid, especially on questions concerning bank de-risking, where sanctions over compliance by banks may put humanitarian aid efforts at risk. She joins us from New York City. Ms. Naheed Farid is a member of Afghanistan's lower house of parliament, elected from Herat, chair of the Human Rights, Civil Society, and Women's Affairs Committee, a member of the International Relations Committee. She's been a fierce advocate for the rights of women and gender equality in her native country. She was forced to flee with her family after the Taliban takeover. We offer you an especially warm welcome. We admire your courage. We're honored to have you with us today, Ms. Farid. Thank you. Thomas Joscelyn's a counterterrorism expert at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, senior editor of its long war journal newsletter, an expert on al-Qaeda and ISIS around the world. Mr. Joscelyn, welcome to the committee. Mr. Smith, please begin your testimony.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to the committee to speak today about the economic impacts of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. In particular, I have been assessing the implications of Taliban's unique status as an entity that's not only assumed control over a country, but also remains subject to sanctions. That dual identity I'm not aware of ever having occurred before. I've submitted written testimony to the committee, and I wanted to use this brief time to provide a brief overview of my assessment. As the committee is well aware, the economic situation in Afghanistan was precarious even before the Taliban took over. 80% of the country's GDP comes from donors. More than half of the population rely on humanitarian aid. Winter is coming, and thousands will likely die. The Taliban has exacerbated this situation. They've limited access to any assistance that remains, and their status as a sanctioned party has essentially frozen them out of access to any of Afghanistan's official assets abroad. The result is a brewing balance of payments crisis and a potential economic meltdown as the country runs out of hard currency. Now, despite the difficulties created by the Taliban sanctions, I've heard no serious considerations that the entity should be removed from the sanctions list, and rightfully so. Consequently, U.S. sanctions policy must continue to work to limit flows and benefits to the Taliban and other sanctioned parties. However, it must also work to ensure that tens of millions of Afghani citizens are not victimized twice over. Once by being subjected to the brutality of the Taliban, and the second time by being denied access to basic needs. Now, such a dual policy is not altruistic, or at least not solely altruistic. We know that without support, Afghanistan could become a failed state. The population could become radicalized. Heroin production could return to being the only viable commercial endeavor in the country. And of course, China and Russia may have an open door into the country. Any of these outcomes, let alone all of them, could be deleterious to our national security interests and the interests of our allies. Now, how should the administration balance these competing interests, prevent the flows to Taliban, while simultaneously encouraging certain dealings by private and public sector actors in Afghanistan that we deem critical to our national security interests? Now, my testimony speaks to two distinct strategies. The first is one for clarity. It's a call for clarity regarding how the administration views the current sanctions on the Taliban. And the second is a call for creativity, using the full breadth of sanctions authorities, including interpretive guidance, licensing, maybe even some forward-leaning humanitarian channels, in order to use the tool as intended. Now, regarding clarity, there is a threshold requirement for how the administration needs to determine how the sanctions with the Taliban, what they actually mean today. There are three options. The U.S. could view the Taliban sanctions as limited solely to those parties specifically identified as sanctioned. Now, this is broadly in line with the model in place against Burma since their coup in February 21. The junta is designated, several members of the government are designated, major economic actors are designated, but the government is not designated, and either is the state. The U.S. alternatively could view the Taliban designation as extending to the government, but not to the state, and that is similar to the model in place in Venezuela. And finally, the U.S. could view the sanctions against the Taliban as extending to the government and the state, which of course is akin to the model we have in place against Iran. Now, as for which interpretation is right or should they proceed with, frankly, the more limited approaches of Burma or Venezuela are probably the ones that provide the most flexibility. But the reality is that any of these approaches could actually provide the policy outcome that are needed, so long as authorizations and interpretation is provided according to the various restrictions in place regarding the others. My second strategy, of course, is calling for creativity. The administration could develop more authorizations and licenses to allow the private sector to assist in promoting U.S. interests. Presently, the Treasury has issued 2 general licenses, these regulatory exemptions, to deal with the Taliban and Haqqani network. I mean, if we want to really limit the flow of funds to the Taliban and Haqqani network while promoting the benefits to the Afghani people, more general licenses are going to be needed. Venezuela, for example, there have been over 30 regulatory exemptions issued in order to limit that exposure to the average Venezuelan versus the Maduro regime. Second, the administration could develop a humanitarian channel, a process that was started in the context of Iran. In such a model, if a party provides the U.S. government diligence and information, theoretically the government could provide an assurance that the U.S. government finds that the channel is not problematic from the perspective of sanctions. Third, creativity is needed with respect to Afghanistan's funds overseas, which include the funds of the Federal Reserve, the special drawing rights at the IMF, etc. In this regard, the administration could also borrow from the Iran sanctions. In the Iran model, Iranian funds are mobilized abroad and outside of the country and cannot be repatriated. However, they can be used under supervision for approved bilateral trade, principally humanitarian and benign consumer goods. I think this model could be of interest in Afghanistan. The administration needs to leverage the flexibility of sanctions. There's barely no limit, regulatorily or precedentially, about the creativity of how one can implement sanctions. And doing so is not just a moral approach, but very much an approach that we need to do in order to achieve our other foreign policy and national security ends. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Ms. Eckert joins us from New York City. Ms. Eckert, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Minority Member Toomey, and members of the committee. It's an honor to appear before this committee, with which I had extensive dealings when I was a staff on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm only sorry that I'm not able to.
We've lost you, Ms. Eckert, if something happened on your end. Let's move on to the.
Are you there?
You think it's okay? Ms. Eckert, until we can fix this jointly, we will move on to the next witness. Sorry about that. Ms. Farid, you're welcome again. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for having me and inviting me to this committee. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of Congress. My name is Naheed Farid. I'm a member of Afghanistan Parliament, representing the people of Herat, which is my hometown. And I've served in Parliament for more than 11 years. Since 2019, I have been the chairperson of Human Rights, Civil Society, and Women Affairs Commission. And here in Washington, D.C., I am an advisory board of the U.S.-Afghan Democratic Peace and Prosperity Council. I appear before you today still in shock that the Taliban and the Haqqani network and Al-Qaeda have taken over Afghanistan. For years, my family and I have faced death threat from the Taliban. I cannot count on how many friends and colleagues I have lost to Taliban violence. A week before they took Kabul, Taliban entered Herat, found my house, searched for my family. Luckily, my family and I were able to escape, but we just left everything behind. For Afghan women of my generation, we remember the Taliban from 1990s. This sudden takeover of the country brings back so many of the nightmares. When I was a girl growing up in Herat, I loved going to school, becoming a pilot one day. And when Taliban took control of Herat, they shut down the schools, and I was forced to spend all of my time at home with my female relatives. Today, we are right now what we as Afghan women have known all along is clear for the world to see. The Taliban cannot be trusted. Afghan women and girls face blatant gender apartheid by Taliban and a return to the 1990s. The Taliban have stripped most women of the ability to work. Girls cannot participate and attend secondary schools. Young women who grew up in a free and open society are now hiding in a fear. Make no mistake, the Taliban govern through fear. Their soldiers indiscriminately whip civilians in the streets. They have resumed public execution and molestations. They have committed forced displacement and atrocities against Tajiks and Hazaras in Panjshir, in Daikundi, and many other places of Afghanistan. They have curbed free speech and decimated Afghanistan's once thriving media sector that we had. So how can Congress help Afghan people? I have had so many meetings with members of Congress these past few years, and I know so many of you have a deep bond with Afghan people, a deep bond with Afghan women, and what the Afghan people need right now are three things. One, immediate humanitarian assistance. 2, legislation that prohibits U.S. recognition and normalization of relations with the Taliban. And 3, support of the local NGOs and civil society who can deliver basic services in the absence of a normal government. Afghanistan faced a dire humanitarian crisis because of the healthcare system collapse, millions of internally displaced persons, and widespread food insecurity in the winter that is coming. Without outside assistance, more Afghans will suffer, more Afghans will die. But the Taliban cannot be allowed to set terms and conditions on how this humanitarian assistance is delivered and who is it delivered to. Humanitarian corridors need to be established where international and local NGOs do deliver their work without any interference from the Taliban. The Taliban regime cannot be trusted because their hardline beliefs and their partnership with dangerous terrorist groups. The Taliban pose an imminent threat to the region and to the world. I urge the members of this committee to support legislations that prevent any U.S. administration from recognizing the Taliban and normalizing any relation with Taliban. I encourage the members of this committee to act quickly in a bipartisan way to draft and pass legislation that encourage no U.S. administration ever recognizes the Taliban. Not only can the Taliban regime be trusted, it also has minimal capacity for governance. We are witnessing the breakdown in basic services such as healthcare and education and banking and finance and aviation and many more. The U.S. should not provide the Taliban with the capacity building support. Instead, the U.S. should provide direct support to Afghan NGOs and civil society. As someone with a background in nonprofit management and a family foundation that built many schools for girls throughout Afghanistan, I know firsthand how valuable local NGOs are to so many ordinary Afghans, especially to women and girls. The U.S. government must find ways to provide funding, capacity building, and also support to those local organizations and NGOs through a very trusted corridor. I'll stop here and looking forward for the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Farid. We will return to Sue Eckert, Ms. Eckert in New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Minority Member Toomey and members of the committee, it's an honor to appear before you today. I'm only sorry I can't join you in person, but there are meetings at the UN Security Council and with member states to talk about the future of the Al-Qaeda, ISIL, and Daesh committee this year that I'm involved with. Thanks to the committee for focusing on this very important topic, and which is important not only for U.S. security and foreign policy, but for the lives of millions of Afghan citizens. So Adam has laid out very well the sanctions situation as it applies to Afghanistan. So I want to take my brief time, to actually focus on 5 points. The first is as our previous speaker just commented, the dire and deteriorating humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Secondly, the need for additional measures by OFAC, the U.S. government, to support NGOs and to continue their programs in support of the Afghan population. Third, the importance of action at the UN Security Council to ensure continuation of humanitarian assistance into Afghanistan. Fourth, the need for international action to create secure and safe channels to move funds into Afghanistan to support NGOs in the near term. And then fifth, just to take this opportunity to look at the system, the sanction system overall, and as an opportunity to improve the process to restore humanitarian exemptions and prevent crisis situations in the future. First, on the humanitarian situation, as noted, even before the Taliban took control, Afghanistan was experiencing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Between COVID, climate change, the 2021 drought, and persistent insecurities and violence, it has been a dire situation. Over half the population of Afghani citizens are in need of humanitarian assistance. Food security is deteriorating rapidly, with only 5% of households consuming adequate levels of food. The recent reports that 3 out of 4 households now limit portion sizes, with adults eating less so their children can eat more. The health system is rapidly deteriorating, with decreasing access to health care. There's more measles, diarrhea, and polio less response to the COVID situation. As the World Health Organization has noted, 17% of over the 2,300 health facilities previously supported by international assistance are suffering and are not fully functional. 2/3 of these facilities have run out of essential medicine. Secondly, when it comes, let me just note that David Beasley, former U.S. Congressman and now Executive Director of the World Food Program, has pleaded that the time is now. We cannot wait 6 months. We need action now before the winter sets in. Secondly, the sanctions situation does complicate the delivery of aid, but there are steps that can be taken to clarify and alleviate some of these challenges. In the U.S., the Biden administration and the new general licenses were very welcome and very important steps, but there's need for additional moves to continue delivery of assistance. Here, we need to extend authorization beyond just basic humanitarian needs to other programs supporting Afghan citizens, and for which the international community has devoted years and millions or billions of dollars supporting. The second is that there needs to be clarification of who the Taliban is, as Adam discussed previously. In addition, however, the UN Security Council needs to safeguard the continuation of humanitarian action. The Security Council resolution adopted on August 30th called for strengthened efforts to provide humanitarian assistance and the support of all donors, but there's need for additional action now. Guidance that sanctions are not intended to impede humanitarian action, and that member states must implement these measures consistent with their commitments under international humanitarian law is one step, but there is a need for a humanitarian carve-out to ensure that these activities and humanitarian assistance can continue. In that regard, the current exception that exists in Somalia is a very good model. Third, we need to ensure new ways for funds to get into Afghanistan. It's going to be months likely before the financial system stabilizes and international payments can be regularized to NGOs. In the meantime, we need a safe and reliable system to move humanitarian funds in. In the medium term, we need to deal with financial institutions to provide the kind of incentive and assurances for them to continue to support NGO operations. And as Adam said, we need to think creatively about ways to address these de-risking issues. Finally, I would just say that this crisis brings into stark relief some of the systemic challenges that exist and provides opportunities to improve the U.S. and the UN sanctioned processes to safeguard humanitarian action through exceptions. Time after time, we face a situation. It's just this year, we've been faced with the threat of withholding humanitarian assistance from Yemen, following the designation of Ansarallah in January, in Burma, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan. There is need for systemic reform to create standing carve-outs for humanitarian action. And in this regard, we need to seriously look at restoring the IEPA exemption, which was contained in the act that the committee passed a number of years ago, but which has been routinely waived. These recommendations don't assume that any of this is necessarily easy, but we need to be realistic about the situation in Afghanistan, which is extremely complicated for NGOs working there. But I think that the overwhelming imperative is to act now, consistent not only with our humanitarian and human rights values, but with our national security and foreign policy as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Eckert. Mr. Joscelyn is recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you for joining us.
Well, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, thank you for inviting me to testify here today. You know, I've done this a number of times. Unfortunately, in the past, it was warning about the impending security situation or fall of the Afghan government. Now we're dealing with the aftermath, of course. And what I want to focus on here today is that many of the factors that we focused on for years at Long War Journal that led to the collapse of the Afghan government and the victory for the Taliban and indeed al-Qaeda are still relevant for the discussions and debates you're going to be having today and in the future. In particular, I want to make 3 quick points. The first one is that, as you both, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Toomey, you both recognized, the Taliban's relationship with al-Qaeda is unbroken. We heard that from the generals last week when they testified here on the Hill. We've heard that from Secretary of State Blinken. I think that's a remarkable fact, if you think about it, right? After 20 years of war and more than 10 years of on-again, off-again diplomacy led by the U.S. with the Taliban, during which time the State Department and the military were desperate to have the Taliban throw al-Qaeda under the bus, they didn't, right? They stood by them this whole time. That's a remarkable fact. And if you think about it, why is that? Why is it that after all these years, going back, in fact, even to the 1990s when the U.S. government first started trying to pressure the Taliban to break with al-Qaeda, why is it that after a generation they haven't? And I think the answer is that there's a lot more to that relationship that many people realize, a lot more to that relationship that people in the U.S. government realize. And I'm going to give you a few details along those lines. But before I move on to my second point, I want to note that in early September, the Taliban, after they took over Afghanistan, they took over, of course, all the media outlets. And one of the things they did when they controlled the media in Afghanistan was they broadcast a video called Victorious Force 3. I suggest if you look at some of my testimony or some of the stuff I post online, you can watch it, and I suggest everyone does. Because they are still saying now in 2021 that we deserve to be attacked on 9/11. That's the official Taliban line. That's been the Taliban's line since Mullah Omar first uttered it in September 26th of 2001. For 20 years now, unbroken, 20 years straight, they've said that America deserved to be attacked on 9/11. That's remarkable. Second point I want to talk about is that the Taliban's regime is an authoritarian regime. The new Taliban is, in fact, just the old Taliban in many ways. In fact, as I was preparing my written testimony today, I was struck by the fact that one of the guys I included in my write-up is a guy named Hassan Akhund. He has been named the head of state or so-called prime minister of the Taliban regime. Of course, he's not really a prime minister, is he? They don't really work that way. But that's the title they gave him in some of the press reporting. But Akhund was actually first sanctioned by the UN in early 2001, 8 months before 9/11. And it was Akhund who, on behalf of the Taliban, rejected the first overtures by the UN to get the Taliban to turn over Osama bin Laden. In fact, in 1999, it was Akhund who said, when the UN demanded that bin Laden be turned over, it was Akhund who answered on behalf of the Taliban and said, in fact, we will not turn over Osama at any price. Those are his words. The Interior Ministry of this authoritarian regime is controlled by Siraj Haqqani. Chairman Brown, you mentioned that. Siraj Haqqani, you can look at my testimony, he's an al-Qaeda man. There's this idea that the Taliban is one thing, the Haqqanis are another, and al-Qaeda is a third thing. That model has been wrong all along. The Haqqanis have a controlling interest in the Taliban. They always did. The Haqqanis play a lead role in controlling hierarchical positions throughout the Taliban. And in fact, the special forces of the Taliban that won the war, including the suicide bombers who played such a prominent role in defeating Afghan forces in America and Afghanistan, were run by the Haqqanis. And we can get into that a little bit more, what that means, because it actually plays out in terms of the security around the airport in Kabul, involved in a Haqqani special forces outfit that actually specializes in suicide bombings. Very spooky, actually. So the Interior Ministry is run by Siraj Haqqani and his family, which has been in bed with al-Qaeda since the 1980s. In fact, they incubated and helped build al-Qaeda. The Intelligence Ministry is run by another guy known as Abdul Haq Wasiq, who was a former Guantanamo detainee. He was too sanctioned in early 2001 by the UN before 9/11, and he was sanctioned. Why? Because he, as the deputy head of intel at the point for the Taliban, actually oversaw foreign fighters for al-Qaeda coming into the country and helped protect al-Qaeda's training camps. So if you think of this as an authoritarian regime, which it is, and they're going to implement their draconian version of Sharia on the Afghan population, as Ms. Farid can tell you better than anyone, and they are, right? The guys who are actually pulling the levers of power for this authoritarian regime have dossiers that are littered with al-Qaeda references. The third point I'd make very quick is that I too am very concerned about the Afghan people. We, of course, got to know quite a few of them during our time doing this at Long War Journal. I would just emphasize something that Ms. Farid said. She said, when it comes to humanitarian assistance, don't let the Taliban decide. That's a very important, powerful point. Because this authoritarian regime here in Afghanistan, to the extent that any humanitarian assistance flows through the Taliban to the Afghan people, that will strengthen their authoritarian regime and legitimize their governance. I'm very open to any of the ideas that Mr. Smith or others have for sort of providing carve-outs around sanctions for humanitarian assistance, working with NGOs, as Ms. Farid said, and others. There are all sorts of options we can explore, but don't empower the Taliban's regime. Thank you.
Mr. Joscelyn, I'll start my questions. I'll start my question with Ms. Farid. You, for years, been a fierce advocate for the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan, as women have made real strides and emerged in key roles throughout society. Your leadership your leadership as a role as a member of the parliament, the many able and distinguished Afghan women with whom you work are key examples. I know you touched on this in your opening statement, but can you describe the current situation for women and girls following the Taliban takeover in urban settings like Kabul and provincial cities like in your home of Herat and in rural settings?
Thank you. I'm not familiar with this. Thank you so much. The situation in Afghanistan is very, very difficult for women. Like 15 million of the population of Afghanistan that are women think that they are abandoned and they have been forgotten. I mean, there was no precondition of women's rights, human rights, the last 20 years of the achievements of Afghan women and Afghan people and Afghan democracy in the peace process with the Taliban. And even with in the withdrawal, there was no precondition. And that's the problem that the people of Afghanistan are thinking, that why, and especially women, why after 20 years we have been forgotten at this level, that 50% of the people that are women and many front runners of the democratic process in Afghanistan, actually they are in a situation that they don't know where to hide, where to escape. Instead of championing them, we actually cannot help them at this point. They are very helpless.
So what more should the U.S. and our allies do to protect the rights of women and girls? What specifically should we do?
In fact, people of Afghanistan, women of Afghanistan, they deserve the government they want. They deserve the government that was not enforced on them, the government that they want to choose. And U.S. has to help the Afghan people, the government that was not forced by atrocities, by violence on the people of Afghanistan. This has to be the strategy, that we have to stand with the people of Afghanistan, and we have to be against the enemies of people of Afghanistan and those who have no plan and a strategy to help the people, but they have the strategy to attack the West. And they have no strategy to do the governance in Afghanistan. See the healthcare system, see the education system, see women, see girls, that they cannot attend secondary school. So the reality is that those terrorist syndicate that took place in Afghanistan, they have no idea how to govern Afghanistan. There has to be a group of NGOs, internal NGOs, regional NGOs, international NGOs, to fill the gap, to fill the vacuum, and support the Afghan women through providing jobs for them, through capacity building, through providing the basic needs of healthcare and education to them. At the same time, Taliban should not decide. Taliban should not say who should receive this aid. Taliban should not put condition on it. And this is the option that we can start with. But there has to be more options to explore in the future.
Let me follow that way of thinking about the Taliban obviously not deciding with Ms. Eckert and then Mr. Smith, the same question. Treasury's issued new license to support the continued flow of humanitarian assistance to people of Afghanistan and other activities that support basic human needs while upholding and enforcing our sanctions against the Taliban and the Haqqani network. What more should Treasury and State be considering, including with international banks, to ensure the people of Afghanistan continue to receive aid without benefiting the Taliban? Ms. Eckert first, and Mr. Smith. Answer that, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think OFAC needs to issue additional general licenses authorizing NGOs programs that go beyond basic human needs. And here we're talking about development programs. We're talking about areas of protection and prevention. We're talking about women's programs, conflict and stabilization, education. These are all programs with which the international community has invested billions of dollars over the last 20 years. And they help the individual Afghan population, not the Taliban. These programs should continue. The way OFAC has currently defined the general licenses, they apply to a narrower set of activities. I think that what we need to do is to broaden it to what that used to exist for Yemen, Burma, and Ethiopia, for the broad range of NGO activities.
You respond to that, too.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. I think that's right. Their licenses and exemptions need to be expanded. I gave an example in my opening statement that if we really want to expand and limit the exposure of the average Afghani, significantly more licenses are going to be needed. But outside licenses, there's one other component I wanted to talk about, and I mentioned it briefly in my opening statement, and that what to do with or how to leverage safely the funds that Afghanistan has outside the country. Now, we of course, should not just identify them as Afghani and let them go. That is not wise. As a matter of sort of technical capacity, the Taliban doesn't have that capacity to even manage them. But I do think that the Iranian model, in which you have funds that have been basically frozen overseas in jurisdictions that continue to buy Iranian oil, those funds are not able to be repatriated to Iran, but they can be used. And they're used with the oversight of local institutions, with the U.S. looking on very carefully for the provision of basically approved bilateral trade, which is humanitarian goods and other sort of goods in kind. And I think if you focus on using these funds not to provide funds, but rather to find goods to the Afghanistan people, will there be some seepage to the Taliban? Unfortunately, I think there will be. But it's much, much harder to make fungible in-kind goods than just opening the spigots of cash. So I think we need to be very creative and learn the lessons we've learned in other jurisdictions in this context as well.
Thank you. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Farid, first of all, thank you so much for being with us today. Just very briefly, if you could, just because I think we should be clear about this. You fled Herat shortly before the Taliban took the city. When they took the city, they came looking for you and your family. What would they have done had you not fled and had they found you?
They would have killed me.
They would have killed you.
Yeah.
Mr. Joscelyn, you made a very interesting point, if I understood it correctly, in your written testimony. I think it's fair to say that you suggested that the distinction between the Taliban and the Haqqani network is really a Western construct. It's not very meaningful to these people. They are so completely intertwined that it's a meaningless distinction. Do I have that right?
That's absolutely correct, Senator.
So money going to the Taliban is the same thing as money going to a notorious terrorist network because they are one and the same.
Correct. The Haqqanis have a controlling interest in the Taliban.
Right. So Mr. Smith made a point that I think is very, very interesting and an important one. One of the things I worry about extending licenses of all kinds to all kinds of groups to conduct all kinds of activities sounds to me like it's likely to include funding, and money is inherently fungible. I worry that it gets in the hands of the Taliban one way or another. But goods, humanitarian goods, food, medicine, basic human needs, those are harder to convert into things like weapons and terrorist activity. So to get them there, I assume, entails significant logistical challenges, not to mention security challenges. My question for, really for each of you is, should the United States be attempting to create or encourage, facilitate some kind of international peacekeeping ability to provide security for humanitarian corridors to deliver life-saving goods? Does that make sense? Mr. Joscelyn, and then Ms. Farid and Mr. Smith.
All I could say is I would bet a large sum of money the Taliban would not allow that. They are an authoritarian regime, as I said, and they're going to control the show.
Right. Ms. Farid?
I think beside of having a peacekeeping coalition, United States needs to partner with a regional player, a regional actor near to Afghanistan. So there will be a base of humanitarian assistance near Afghanistan where NGOs can operate, where NGOs can have a staff that can collect wages there. I think that also is very important, that this corridor has to have a base around Afghanistan in countries like Tajikistan. So we have to have partners with the United States around Afghanistan that can facilitate this corridor. And also, this banking system should not operate inside of Afghanistan because the head of central bank of Taliban is a terrorist. And any money that goes through Western Union, any other procedure, they have hand, they can block, they can do anything with that money.
Mr. Smith?
Ranking Member Toomey, I think to the extent the establishment of a channel for physical goods is possible, leaving aside what Mr. Joscelyn thinks would likely happen, I think it's critical. Whether or not the U.S. should do it on its own is a different story. I do think that multilateralization of these efforts, especially through regional partners, as Ms. Farid suggests, I think is really the way forward. And, of course, leveraging truly multilateral components, be it the World Bank, be it the UN, UNDP, and others. So, yes, I think that I agree with you. I think that the opening the spigots for funds is much, much more dangerous than opening the spigot for goods, food, and other sorts of services that are not so easily fungible.
But what about Mr. Joscelyn's point that it's unlikely that the Taliban would tolerate any foreign force, even one that doesn't have a history of antagonism, for instance? Is that a serious obstacle?
I think it could be a serious obstacle for sure. And I don't think we need to recognize the Taliban to potentially, on a transactional basis, deal with the Taliban. And so I think that over time, especially if the situation in Afghanistan gets more and more dire, there may be openings to allow this sort of very transactional approach to allow certain goods or services into Afghanistan. But it may be a while, and there may be some interesting sort of quid pro quos that Taliban tries to exert on that basis.
Well, just to be clear, my own view is that it would be a monumental mistake for us to recognize the Taliban, and I'm sympathetic to the idea that Ms. Farid suggested that legislation to preclude that might make a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Toomey?
Thank you. Oh, yes. Ms. Eckert, you would go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to Mr. Toomey's question as well, in that the mandate for the UNAMA, the UN mission in Afghanistan, is being considered, and the U.S. will have the opportunity to decide what kind of UN presence on the ground that we want to have. I do not think that anyone is talking about turning on the spigot and handing out cash. What we're talking about is getting funds into the country for NGOs to pay staff, to buy goods that they need, and to distribute the kind of assistance that we're talking about. So I don't see anyone saying that we need to either recognize the Taliban or not sanction the Taliban, or provide any kind of support. We're talking about providing assistance to the Afghan people.
Thank you, Ms. Eckert. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've been clear that I believe that President Biden made exactly the right decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. As General Milley testified last week in response to my questions at the Armed Services hearing, another few months or another few years were unlikely to have changed the outcome of the war. And I looked up General Milley's words and brought them with me, because here's what he said. The end state probably would have been the same no matter when our troops pulled out. General Milley also acknowledged to me at this hearing that our troops would have been needed indefinitely in order to continue to prop up the government, and that it would have been at great risk, not only to our troops, but also to the Afghan people. So let me just ask, I have three of you here. Does anybody disagree with General Milley's assessment? I take that as three head shakes no. That nobody disagrees.
I don't disagree, Senator. I mean, I've covered the insurgency for 12 to 15 years of my life, and there's no doubt that the end state was you could keep pushing it off. Our suggestion, Senator, real quick, was that if the U.S. was leaving some years ago, was to leave in a way that allowed the Afghans to own the fight. Our big critique was that across two administrations that never happened. Now, maybe it would have failed anyway. It probably would have, but at least allow them to own the fight, and I don't think we did.
Well, I appreciate that you want to push back on this, but I also asked about that question, about how we exited Afghanistan. And the point that the generals made, although there's been criticism from the Republican side of the House, is the military designed the withdrawal and executed the withdrawal. They were given every resource and every bit of support that they asked for. And we faced what we faced when the government fled and when the military, the Afghan military, laid down their arms and melted back into the countryside. So they had everything they asked for in this withdrawal. You know, for years, the DOD leaders told the Armed Services Committee and the American people about the great progress that we were making. But as we know from the Afghanistan papers published by the Washington Post, that simply was not true. So some of our military leaders, the same military leaders who have basically been wrong about Afghanistan for nearly 20 years now, wanted to leave troops in Afghanistan, but leave them there forever, because if we brought them home, the Afghan government would collapse. Now the Republicans are trying to make this an issue, not because of oversight, but because they think it helps them politically. During the Trump years, the Armed Services Committee only held 4 public hearings on Afghanistan. Over those 4 years, the Taliban was making steady gains year by year. I don't recall this committee ever having a hearing on Afghanistan before today. And I welcome our colleagues' newfound interest in oversight over Afghanistan, but I wish they'd been interested 5 years ago or 10 years ago when it might have made a real difference. The president made the right decision to withdraw. I don't think I'm hearing any objection on that. Once he made that decision, he followed the advice and recommendations of the military in executing the withdrawal. And now that we finally ended our military presence in Afghanistan, I agree it is time to have a sanctions policy that doesn't make it more difficult for the Afghan people to have a chance to rebuild. That is our sole responsibility here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Rounds from South Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I was going to begin with a line of questioning with regards to how we get the relief back into Afghans who are starving. And yet, right now, I think I have to respond a little bit. I think I was at all of the same meetings as my colleague from Massachusetts, and I came away with a slightly different approach that was being conducted. It's my understanding in reviewing and in listening to the generals, 3 of them, who were before our Armed Services Committee, not just in public session, but in classified sections, who made it very clear that they would never withdraw on a date certain, and that to a person, the recommendations that had been provided was to do a conditions-based withdrawal with the hopes that, first of all, it would be a withdrawal that was not in chaos, and it would have allowed the Afghan government an opportunity to continue with a reserve force continuing there. The conditions-based versus date certain would have allowed that the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban would have been held in check. I'm just going to, and ma'am, I'm going to begin with you. Would you share with us, as a representative of the Parliament of Afghanistan, what your expectations had been with regard to a transfer of the responsibilities for the defense of Afghanistan directly to the national government? Can you share what your goals had been and what happened when there was a date certain established?
Thank you so much. Both questions, I want to answer both questions, actually. And, the day that Doha Agreement was signed, it emboldened Taliban. Then the withdrawal announcement even gave them more power that demoralized the Afghan National Security Forces. And that led to more demoralization of the people of Afghanistan. Okay, so there are so many factors that contributed to the situation, but one of them was a hasty withdrawal. The hasty withdrawal was one of the reasons that unfortunately led to the situation that we have right now. level of loss that Afghan security forces had was 100 casualties per day. That level of loss is unsustainable for any security forces in the world. It's unbelievable that we are losing 100 soldiers per day. Okay, so this was the situation. Unfortunately, besides the Air Force was grounded because of the withdrawal, because half of the Air Force had to have the maintenance that the contractors already left due to the withdrawal. Also, that also contributed to the situation, and we also lost so many brave commandos, brave soldiers, policemen, police officers in the front line of the battle of fighting against global terrorism, against Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and Haqqani network. Okay, we shouldn't forget them and we have to admire them. But at the same time, I, as a member of parliament, and many in my parliament, we use the platforms, different platforms, including being the advisory board of DPPC, Democratic Peace and Prosperity Council. We met with, at 1 week before the collapse, we met with Armed Service Committee and Foreign Affairs Committee of the Congress, telling them about the pending collapse of Afghanistan. Factors inside of Afghanistan also contributed to the situation. For example, the mismanagement of the peace process by Afghanistan government, President Ghani and his national security advisor, the mismanagement of war effort by isolating so many advisors and generals and replacing them by loyalists that surrounded to Taliban just in the months of July and August also contributed to the situation. But here we are. We could have been in a better situation if the announcement of the withdrawal would not happen at the beginning of the seasoning of fight of Taliban. If U.S. could wait few more months until the winter finished, and the fighting season of Taliban would have finished because so many other things happened, and peace still happened, the withdrawal announcement also happened, and demoralized the situation, and the soldiers of the army and Afghan National Security Forces and the defense forces, we would have been in a better situation.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Round. Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to see the Banking Committee is interested in foreign affairs issues, so good to have the hearing. Let me ask Mr. Smith. OFAC issued 2 general licenses on September 24th to better facilitate the flow of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. How exactly do these licenses work? And how does the Treasury ensure that assistance does not go to the Taliban or the Haqqani network?
Thank you, Senator. Both of those are very good questions. The way the licenses work, well, maybe to begin with, why the licenses are needed. So both the Haqqani network and the Taliban are sanctioned parties, which means that any individual who's a U.S. person, U.S. company, U.S. party, non-U.S. party that engages through the United States cannot engage with them without risking criminal and civil liability. And so these licenses allow exemptions, allow certain exemptions that are specified in the licenses to provide certain goods that are articulated within the licenses to certain individuals and certain parties. So one license covers the activities of sort of the NGO community, right, which includes sort of not just the U.S. government as a large as a government organization, but multilateral organizations and non-governmental organizations as well, providing humanitarian services. And then the other license is principally to do with the delivery of food, foodstuffs, medicine, et cetera. As well. So both of those licenses allow activities that would otherwise be prohibited, namely potential transactions with parties that would be sanctioned. And those licenses allow those exemptions to allow, hopefully, the activities that are articulated. Now, there's a good question, and Ranking Member Toomey, I think, asked this question as well. How do you make sure that the benefits don't go to the Taliban? And that's a great question. And I think that the way the licenses are structured, and frankly, the reporting obligations and the oversight that people are going to impose on the licenses are going to require sort of a lot of care and carefulness with respect to parties who want to use them. But I think one of the key pieces that makes this perhaps less likely to be abused in that fashion is what they're asking to be delivered, usually, at least on the second license with respect to medicine and medical devices, are hard goods, right? In-kind goods, as opposed to just funds. So is it possible that in-kind goods could be taken off a truck by the Taliban and sold on the market for hard currency? Of course it could. It is significantly more difficult, however, for that to happen than if just cash was put into the system in the hands of anybody. So I think that that's the key issue here, is they're trying to focus much more on in-kind goods and services rather than simply cash flows. Into
Well, you have a Taliban government that has Haqqani sanctioned individuals in its government. And so while we want to, of course, assist the Afghan people, we have to be robustly resolute that the Taliban does not get access to these funds, especially when we have sanctioned individuals in their government. Otherwise, our sanctions regime is meaningless at the end of the day. Let me ask you, the OFAC general licenses, I'll ask both you and Mr. Eckert, were welcomed by humanitarian organizations as a necessary protection for those NGOs seeking to stay and deliver in time of skyrocketing humanitarian need in Afghanistan. However, we've seen in other contexts general licenses are sometimes necessary, but not necessarily sufficient to ensure humanitarian NGOs have sufficient financial access to provide assistance in crisis area under the control of sanctioned actors. What additional actions should OFAC consider to safeguard aid operations in Afghanistan? If the United States chooses to differentiate between sanctioned Taliban officials and ministry bureaucrats that work under them, how do we ensure that the Taliban doesn't divert away from the vulnerable groups?
Ms. Eckert?
Thank you, Mr. Menendez. In terms of dealing for the NGOs, it's very important, and the administration took the very critical step of authorizing the transmission of goods, services, et cetera, of NGOs for the range of humanitarian activities that meet basic human needs. But that's only part of the question. The other is, how do funds get to the NGOs in country? And right now, there's a critical liquidity crisis. The banks have limited to $200 a week the amount of withdrawals that can happen. We've frozen the cash. The Taliban is enormously strapped. The central bank does not have Afghani notes, and they don't have U.S. dollars. So there's a real liquidity crisis. So for U.S. banks or for banks to support humanitarian action, they're going to be very hesitant to send funds into Afghanistan, and legitimately so, because even the banks who don't have an interest by the government have very significant concerns about to whom they can let the funds go. So in the short term, I think one of the things that the U.S. and the international community needs to do is to establish this unique safe payment mechanism in order to negotiate the transmission of funds for humanitarian and NGO activities to ensure that they go to those activities. And this is something that will require thought and, as Adam notes, creativity. But it's something that we need to work with the financial system, because there's no incentive. There are places that banks are not going to take the risk of transferring funds. I've had financial institutions tell me, North Korea, for example, even though there's humanitarian needs there, they do not want certain transactions on their books. So they're being very hesitant. And in order to encourage them, once the financial situation in Afghanistan stabilizes, because right now we do have this liquidity crisis, but once it stabilizes, we're going to need to provide some level of encouragement. And there are a number of things that can be done in discussion with financial institutions. One of them is actually providing some kind of formalization of OFAC's policy about non-enforcement. But there are a number of things that need to take place as part of the discussion with financial institutions. But right now, they're not going to be able to get the funds in. We need a channel to get funds and goods that can go for these purposes and to be controlled so the Taliban does not have access to it.
Oh, thank you. I'll be monitoring this very closely. Thank you.
So thanks, Senator. And the senator from North Carolina, Senator Tillis, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. And Mr. Joscelyn, it's good to see you again. Mr. Joscelyn testified before Senate Armed Services last week. Mr. Joscelyn, I think I'm going to start with you. The Taliban, to me, is no different today than it was 20 years ago. They may be slightly more sophisticated. They may be a little bit better on social media since it emerged since then. But they're still ruthless. They're murderers. They repress women. They threaten children. So should the USG ever grant the Taliban access to Afghanistan's foreign reserves, including the $7 billion at the NY Fed?
I agree wholeheartedly with your characterization of the Taliban being the same old Taliban, and I have a lot of reservations about granting them access to any hard cash.
Yeah, and the reason for that is that if we thought that it was going to go to fund medical facilities in the outlying areas of Afghanistan, which we now know are going to be in retreat, if we thought it was to operate schools that young girls could go to, then certainly we wouldn't be having this discussion. It's because we know what it's going to go to. It's either going to go in the pockets of corrupt Taliban leaders, or it's going to go to support their malign efforts, including their relationship with al-Qaeda. Ms. Farid, do you agree with that?
I agree, and I also addressed at the beginning that this money will go to Taliban. They should not even given the permission to have any condition on any decision regarding the humanitarian corridors and funds to Afghan people.
And Mr. Smith?
Absolutely. I think the money, if you give the money to the Taliban, that is what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Is it also true that first the Taliban's having a problem paying their light bills, and it looks like their primary source, they import virtually all the electricity in a grid that they constantly blew up when they were in various parts of the country. So their main sources are smuggling, the opium trade, and now maybe mineral mining with the help of China. But should any governing, using quotes, body, should they ever be seriously considered for any sort of recognition by the IMF or any other world agency?
I certainly don't think so. I do, however, think we can de-link the question of recognition from the broader question of how to provide services and support the Afghani people.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Joscelyn, how do you think, you can add to that if you want to, but how do you think China's role there, particularly with mineral extraction, is going to blossom in the coming months and years? And what kind of threat does that rise to an inflow of cash that could help stabilize the Taliban administration? I refuse to call them a government.
On the first point about recognition, no, absolutely not. There's no reason to give them a political victory to compound their military victory. They are the same old Taliban. China has been willing to do business with the Taliban for quite some time. We tracked the Doha delegation would go from meeting with U.S. officials in Qatar, and all of a sudden, a few weeks later, they'd be in Beijing cutting deals with the Chinese. We don't know the terms of those, but we know that the Chinese are basically willing to play ball for mineral extraction and for other initiatives. The one thing that the Taliban has to guarantee the Chinese government is that they won't allow the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is in fact part of al-Qaeda and fought for the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and its resurrection. They have to guarantee that the Uyghurs in that Turkestan Islamic Party won't actually attack in Xinjiang and won't cause terrorist operations. Remains to be seen if they can deliver on that guarantee.
Ms. Farid, you are clearly the most experienced in terms of the life that you lived in Afghanistan and the extraordinary accomplishment that you made as a female Afghani and being elected. What opportunity exists out there with a nation of 39 million people, half of whom are less than 19 years old? I think probably 70% of whom are less than 25 years old. So they've gotten a glimpse of what life can be without a Taliban leadership. What optimistic message can you send to the men and women who fought there, who sowed those seeds?
I want to quote one of officials of Afghanistan that said that Afghanistan is not dead, it is wounded. And the majority of the population, that 70% are under the age of 30, 50% of the population that are women, they're all there. Afghanistan exists. And as I told you, a syndicate took over as a group that wanna rule Afghanistan by force, but that's not the government people of Afghanistan want. People of Afghanistan want to choose who rule the country. Maybe a woman. And that's why I'm very hopeful. I'm hopeful that the allies of Afghan people, including U.S. Congress, continue to help Afghan people, Afghan women, build the corridors to help and capacity building the local NGOs of Afghanistan, building a coalition, a global coalition to ban any recognition of Taliban, and also helping humanitarian funds to go to Afghanistan and prevent the problem and the shortage of food and the shortage of healthcare that people of Afghanistan are suffering.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Joscelyn, Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Senator Brown. I just appreciate the committee having this hearing, and I've only got one question for the panel, but I do want to frame a little bit of this. I feel like, I'll be careful how I state this, sitting from my position from the Intel Committee. I think the intelligence community, frankly, got it right here. They were predicting weeks and months from when we left in terms of the demise of the government, not days or weeks. I don't think any of us could have necessarily predicted that President Ghani would have cut and run the way he did. And I also share some concerns about the administration, but I think, frankly, the biggest mistake the administration made was not warning the American people that when you exit a country after 20 years involvement, there was no easy way for that to happen. And that decision, which had been initiated by President Trump, and I don't even necessarily criticize him, because I think as things will come out, we'll see that there were huge concerns, and I give credit to the incredible story of Ms. Farid, but concerns about this government that were dating back years. And with the awful exception of the bombing that took place a few days before our troops left, the fact that we had gone for a year plus with no American soldiers killed in combat, and that doesn't erase the tragedy of the 13 American soldiers, but also the countless Afghans that were murdered by that ISIS-K bombing. But it is, and I share Senator Tillis's comments, I think probably the committee, that Taliban has not changed. But we have an enormous challenge going forward. I share we shouldn't be granting recognition, but we do still have this uneasy ability. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the American military, along with our services, got 125,000 people out of Afghanistan, the largest airlift ever. And overwhelming number of Americans, the fact that we don't keep tabs on Americans regardless of country. So the idea that there were still some left, they don't have to self-identify. Many of them are dual citizens. Many, even in the days leading up, did not want to leave yet because they still had family and others. And one of the stories, and again, this is just, I think, just a factual basis, I'm not making a judgment, that even after our troops left, we still see a trickle, but a steady trickle, of American citizens, green card holders, and SIVs coming out either on charter flights or certain commercial flights, particularly from Qatar. So how we manage this relationship while we still have either citizens and or Afghan allies to extract them from country is, I think, a tricky, and I think we need to tread carefully. Again, not by any means thinking that the Taliban have changed their stripes, but realizing that in this kind of period right now, if we can still get people out, that is helpful. The question I want to ask for the panel, and I'm down to only a minute left, so I'd ask you, apologize, is, I'm gravely concerned about China and the Communist Party of China's filling part of the vacuum. And I believe, sir, you touched on part of this, but how big a threat and concern should that be for us in this country? Please.
Thank you, Senator. I think it's a significant concern. As Mr. Joscelyn pointed out, and as we know from around the world, China does not have the same views as we do on moral issues, on the ability to deal with governments that we may not like. And I think their willingness to go in, if only for Belt and Road reasons, if not for minerals or otherwise, I think is rather significant. And they've made it very clear, frankly, that they've wanted to go in for 20 years and haven't been able to. So I do think they're standing there, and I think the way to fill a vacuum is by filling a vacuum. And I think we need to do that through licenses and sort of clever engagement with the Afghan people, but I agree, not necessarily engagement with the Taliban itself.
Afghanistan problem was not just a national problem. It's a proxy war that so many Afghan people actually suffered from that proxy war, that the players in the region wanna have their intelligence inside of Afghanistan to attack their adversaries. But the situation right now is getting very complicated because Taliban are isolated and they have engagement with U.S. adversaries. And one of them is China. And just thinking of that China can protect the borders and it's far away from Afghanistan and it's a little bit in upper geography of Afghanistan, in Badakhshan, that cannot be accessed easily, I think that's not correct. China is going to be a player in the future in Afghanistan because they already had some relationship with Taliban through Pakistan, and Pakistan facilitated that, unfortunately.
Just real quick, I would just say, look, I think the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is probably going to join the anti-American axis on the world stage, where China and other actors are basically emboldening anybody who's against us, and they're willing to do business with them on an amoral fashion because they don't play by the same rules, as Mr. Smith said, as we do. It's part of the reason why I'm skeptical of the argument that America has leverage over the Taliban now and the Taliban's government with financial aid or anything else. I don't think that's true. I think that the Taliban can turn to a number of bad actors for support, and they're already doing so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Warner?
Ms. Eckert?
Might I just add one point, and I think it's very clear that China will act in its best interests and it will try to take advantage of the situation in which the United States is not there now. However, we do have some shared interest. China has largely been a supporter of efforts to counter al-Qaeda, ISIL and other terrorist group. They have no reason to want regional instability. And I think an economic and humanitarian crisis there is not something that benefits them either. So I do think that we have some common ground to work with other countries who don't necessarily share our values, but don't want to see this become a safe haven again for terrorists and other activities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Senator Haggerty from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey. Appreciate your holding this. And Senator Warner, I share your concerns about China's interest here. I fear deeply that assets like Bagram, that lithium deposits, could actually become a crown jewel in China's Belt and Road. So thank you for raising that issue. I'd like to turn my question eventually to you, Mr. Joscelyn. Come back to the fact that the Biden administration's catastrophic withdrawal has created a series of colossal economic, humanitarian, and national security crises that are going to continue to unfold over the next few years. And I share the views that have been shared by many here, that the Taliban are unreformed. In fact, they may feel vindicated politically in what they've accomplished, and I don't think any of us share their violent and retrograde worldview. It's very clear that the Biden administration needs to work to ensure that the world does not recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, and this administration must work to restrict the Taliban's access to financial resources, which I agree the Taliban will use to further this sadistic behavior. Since 2002, the Taliban has been designated as a specially designated global terrorist organization, which makes them subject to counterterrorism sanctions. This designation must remain, and Treasury must be cautious when considering any loosening of the sanctions regime that we already have in place. Members of this committee and this administration may be tempted by a false choice that resources can somehow safely be channeled to halt a humanitarian catastrophe. But this wishful thinking, I feel concerned, will result in yet another national security catastrophe when the Taliban inevitably redirect those funds to their own purposes. We can't support a government or an economy that's inseparable from a terrorist organization. Mr. Joscelyn, you've already noted that Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's the leader of the Haqqani network, also serves as the Taliban's deputy leader. He's the interior minister of the new Taliban government. And you already noted the Taliban, the Haqqani network, Al-Qaeda are essentially the same. So my question to you, Mr. Joscelyn, would you recommend that this administration formally designate the Taliban as a foreign terrorist organization?
I think as a matter of fact, if the Haqqani network is a foreign terrorist organization, and it is and has been since 2012, then the Taliban should be. The Haqqanis have a controlling interest in the Taliban. It was that sort of distance between the two that was imagined by the U.S. government doesn't actually exist. And so if we're going to deal in facts, then I would say, yes, the Taliban should be a foreign terrorist organization. But it's almost something beyond that, right? It's almost beyond even a state sponsor of terrorism at this point. We now have, as Mr. Smith said, we have really a terrorist state. It's not even just a terrorist sponsoring state. And so it's almost like a new category beyond our normal categories.
You got at this briefly with Senator Tillis, and I've got slightly different numbers. It may be $7 billion. I've got $9.5 billion of Afghan central bank funds. But are there any circumstances under which you would recommend that we release those funds?
I can't imagine any.
I thought so. Another question for you, and this is very concerning. Do you believe that it's possible that the Taliban turned a blind eye that regrettable day that ISIS attacked the Abbott Gate, the day that we lost 13 American service members? What do you think might have happened that day?
Senator, I can't say with certainty. What I can say is that days before the bombing, we wrote up a report at Long War Journal about the security forces that were being placed by the Taliban outside the airport. Those security forces were heavily dominated by an arm of the Taliban known as the Badri 313. You can go through the history of Badri 313. They specialize in suicide and complex suicide attacks. And in fact, they honor throughout their propaganda a guy named Ustad Yasir, who was an Osama bin Laden man, worked for bin Laden and Zawahiri, and helped build this paramilitary force for the Taliban and the Haqqanis. And they glorify martyrdom. So do I know that they let him through? No. Do I have any evidence that they did? No. But we were very suspicious before the attack of why it was that Badri 313 was stationed outside the airport.
I agree with you. I'm deeply concerned as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Eckert, Senator Van Hollen from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all our witnesses here today. We, of course, don't have time in this hearing to go over all the mistakes the United States made in its policies toward Afghanistan over the last 20 years. But given some of the comments I heard this morning and from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I think it's important to explain what the Biden administration inherited. It was October 2018 when the Trump administration strong-armed the government of Pakistan to release 2 Taliban commanders. One was the co-founder of the Taliban. The other was number 2, Baradar, who we see in all these photos. They then went to Doha and cut the Afghan government out of the negotiations, further undermining their credibility. Then they told the Afghan government that was not at the table to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, many of whom returned to the battlefield. Then we had an agreement that said, don't attack U.S. forces, but go ahead and attack the Afghan forces with impunity. And by the way, let's also tie the hands of the Afghan forces. You cannot enter villages after dark, but the Taliban can. That is the situation that the Biden administration inherited. And after all that, Donald Trump criticized President Biden for not pulling out our forces even earlier in April. So it's great to hear all this revisionist history. It's interesting to hear folks criticize the situation now when we didn't hear a peep earlier on. So here we are. It's a desperate situation. The Taliban is in control of the country. But I do think that we have an obligation to try to provide humanitarian assistance. And yes, we have to make sure it doesn't go through the Taliban. So some have proposed that we add sanctions on top of the sanctions regime that we already have, including designating the Taliban as a foreign terrorist organization. As I look at this, it's not clear to me what additional leverage we gain, but it does seem that we could put at jeopardy independent international organizations that would be providing humanitarian assistance and potentially subject them to criminal and other penalties. Mr. Smith, what is your view of that?
I think that's exactly right, Senator. They are already sanctioned, and so at least in one respect, there's not much difference if you were to make an FTO, but the one you just suggested. And we know that this is the case because when the Houthis in Yemen were designated FTO at the end of the Trump administration, this was the big concern of the UN and other agencies, that if they were at FTOs, we would have to pull out and not be able to work with them. So I think that is a very real concern. If the issue is, do we have enough control or sort of coercive authority on them right now, I would argue we do. The SDGT designation is significant. It limits U.S. persons from engaging with them and U.S. banks or otherwise. But the FTO designation I don't think is needed, and I think does have that added risk you just suggested.
And others have suggested that we designate Afghanistan, the country of Afghanistan, as a state sponsor of terror. Wouldn't that, in fact, de facto recognize the Taliban government as the legitimate government of Afghanistan?
It may well. I mean, I think we're in definitely a new world here of having a sanctioned terrorist group take over a country. So I haven't quite figured out whether an SST designation would require a identification of Taliban as the government, but it probably would. Right. So it's sort of an ironic sort of conclusion to that, yeah.
Right. So again, as you pointed out, we already have a sanctions regime on the Taliban. That sanctions regime already creates lots of leverage. The question of whether we can successfully utilize that leverage is another question. What should we be looking for, Mr. Smith, in terms of whether or not our withholding of assistance in order to get the 5 concessions we've talked about, a more inclusive government, which of course is not in existence today, human rights extended to women and girls, making sure that Afghanistan is not, again, used as a platform for terrorist attacks, and the other conditions. What should we be looking for in terms of any conduct from the Taliban to suggest that that kind of pressure is working? Because count me as a skeptic, as others, but what would you be looking for?
No, I think we're all skeptical, and I think for good reason. And so I think that I'm concerned that those requests are sort of falling on deaf ears and perhaps are going to be impossible to meet in the near term. But much as we have negotiated and discussed sort of engagements with parties we don't like in the past, be it Iran, for example, there are times where we can figure out ways to engage with people with whom we don't like, with whom we don't agree, with whom we don't recognize on a transaction-by-transaction basis. So I think that we go small steps by small steps. I do think we need to open up some humanitarian corridors, and there's a bit of risk, I have to admit. And if the Taliban don't behave themselves, as Mr. Joscelyn suggested they won't, and they may well, then we have to reassess. But I think that's a step-by-step process that could take quite some time.
Thank you. Time is short. I could go on, but thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Van Hollen. Senator Moran from Kansas is recognized.
Chairman, thank you. Mr. Smith, Ms. Eckert, I've worked with my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, across the aisle to try to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, where the key parts of the country remained in control of the Houthis. What, if any, lessons from that experience can be applied to our situation in Afghanistan?
The one, before turning over to Ms. Eckert, who has quite a bit more experience in Yemen, I think the example I just gave to Senator Van Hollen with respect to the FTO designation is a big one, right? When the Trump administration called the Houthis a foreign terrorist organization, the impact was really quite severe and quite immediate with respect to multilateral organizations like the UN. And so I think that's one of the lessons that we learned from there, that we don't necessarily need to go that far in order to maintain the leverage that we have. But Ms. Eckert?
Thank you. Let me just say that there was a crisis that was averted, and thank you for your role in doing that by having had the Ansar Allah or the Houthis designated as a foreign terrorist organization. From NGOs who were working, providing food and humanitarian assistance in Yemen, they said even with the announcement that they were going to designate them as an FTO, they ceased operations. And so there was a significant drop even in assistance that went in with that announcement. So it would have been devastating in cutting off humanitarian assistance into the country. And in reference to Senator Van Hollen's question, if we were to designate them as a state sponsor of terrorism, leaving aside the question of recognition, which is a legal question I do not know the answer, but it would prohibit a whole range of assistance. Under the Foreign Assistance Act, no funds can go to a state sponsor of terrorism. So we would not want to go that. The current designations and the current sanctions that we have, as well as the frozen assets that are maintained, as well as the reserves and assets, maintain a good amount of leverage. And it may be, as our colleagues have suggested, that ultimately this won't prove successful in moving the Taliban, but we don't need additional sanctions at this point in order to complicate the situation even more.
Thank you both for your answers. Mr. Joscelyn, in your written testimony, you declare that the U.S., quote, never had any leverage over the Taliban, and there is no good reason to think that it has any now. Mm-hmm. So if the prospects for humanitarian aid and other assistance won't work, and decades of sanctions haven't worked, what path do you propose we follow?
You know, I really don't know. To be honest, I've documented this for so long. All I can say is I've seen all these different things attempted, and we never did have any leverage over them. And I give you all the reasons why I say that. I hear what Mr. Smith is saying, and I also have similar language in my testimony about hard humanitarian assistance. He said it better than I did about in-kind, hard goods. I think that's the best way to go to try and help the Afghan people. But in terms of this idea that we're going to be able to use funds or money or any of this assistance to gain leverage to change the Taliban from being something other than the Taliban, I think we have 25 years of experience that says that isn't going to happen.
Thank you for your straightforward non-answer. It was an answer, and I appreciate it. Ms. Farid, special envoys from China, Russia, and Pakistan met with the Taliban officials last month. China and Iran have pledged aid. How do the Afghans view this?
This is really unfortunate, as I said before, that Afghan people are experiencing a regional battle inside of Afghanistan. And Pakistan is always thinking of Afghanistan as its strategic depths. And so many of the other issues contributed to the fact that now we have China, we have Pakistan, we have Russia, and other countries like Iran that are backing Taliban. And Taliban are not the government that Afghan people want. Afghan people want a free, democratic country and free democratic government that they choose by themselves. I mean, they continue this resistance. You see the resistance of the people in social media. You see how brave women and men of Afghanistan are, saying that we don't want this kind of government and this kind of atrocity and this kind of bloodshed and mutilation and a public execution of the people in front of our kids. And as a matter of the fact, we have to let the world know that Taliban are not the government that people of Afghanistan want. They have engagement with the terrorist groups in the region. They have terrorists in their cabinets. They have terrorists who are at the wanted list of United Nations, in the blacklist of United Nations. And this Taliban have to be wiped out from Afghanistan. Afghan people have to have the right to choose who they want to have as a ruler of the country.
Thank you. Thank you for your clarity. Mr. Chairman, thank you to you and Senator Toomey for hosting this hearing.
Senator Smith of Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Chair Brown, and thank you very much to our panelists. I realize that we are running a little short of time, and so I'm going to ask just one question, Chair Brown. I know that Reverend Warnock is interested in asking questions as well, so I'll be brief. But I'd like to direct my question to Ms. Farid, if I could. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you so much for your courageous work advocating for women and girls in Afghanistan. My question is this: the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan has resulted in the interruption of education for thousands of women and girls, and it's unlikely that many of them will be able to resume that education, particularly in rural areas. This is a huge blow. My question is, if women continue to be excluded from educational and employment opportunities, what do you see as the long-term impacts to the economic security of Afghan women and their families? And do you think that this will further exacerbate the ongoing economic crisis that we see in Afghanistan? And then just as a follow-up, what are the most important things that we could do to build capacity right now?
Thank you. Very important question. Women of Afghanistan showed to the world in the last 20 years how brave they are. And they showed that they can be agents for change. And Taliban recognized that, understand that if they let women of Afghanistan continue to be as free as they have been, they will change the country. And then there won't be a suppression that Taliban have. They cannot continue to do the same rules that they have right now over Afghanistan if we have a different situation for women. So that's a fundamental issue. The Taliban don't want women to be a part of the development because they're afraid. And in the future, we will have a country that cannot fly because one wing is not able to fly. Women, half of the population, and that's the reality.
You make such a good point that it is not only the economic capacity of Afghan women, but also the political and organizing capacity of Afghan women that is jeopardized. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr.
Thanks, Senator
Chair.
Smith. Senator Daines of Montana is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. President Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan has made our nation less safe. We lost 13 American troops who were heroically conducting a rescue operation that could have been completely avoided in the first place. The administration left an untold number of Americans and some of our veterans' closest Afghan allies behind enemy lines. And the U.S. is now far more vulnerable to terrorist attacks down the road. In fact, according to General Milley, he is not confident that the U.S. could deny al-Qaeda or ISIS the ability to use Afghanistan as a launchpad for terrorism both in the region and around the world. This reckless withdrawal from Afghanistan was completely bungled, mismanaged, and its harm to our national security will be seen and felt far beyond those tragic weeks that we saw in August. It will hurt our security for the months and the years ahead. The chaotic withdrawal also triggered a refugee crisis that has only worsened Americans' confidence in the Biden administration. In late August, the Secretary of Homeland Security granted humanitarian parole status into the United States to tens of thousands of Afghans. They provide us a flowchart after flowchart of how vetting these individuals is supposed to work, but far from sufficient proof that it is working as promised. Indeed, 6 weeks later, the administration still has not told us much about these individuals. How many work directly and verifiably with U.S. troops or others in our government? We've asked, but they haven't answered. What is the age and gender breakdown of the Afghan parolees? These are not difficult questions. We've asked, they've had no answer back. And most important, we've asked for detailed information about what, if any, vetting of parolees was done beyond database checks among federal agencies. More than a month later, we still don't have reliable or complete answers. We've also asked how many Afghans at overseas U.S. military bases were identified as being possible threats and transferred to Kosovo for additional screening. Again, no answer. Just last Friday, my staff visited Camp Upshur in Quantico to see firsthand the situation on the ground. They left with more questions than answers. DHS and State Department officials at this location were unable to, or unwilling to answer very simple and direct questions brought about demographics, vetting, or prioritization of those who were brought into the U.S. from the lily pad sites. The administration's refusal to answer these questions has created tremendous unease among many Americans, and that is unacceptable. I stand with our U.S. veterans in support of welcoming fully vetted Afghan SIV holders to our country or another allied country. But I'm troubled the Biden administration has been unwilling or unable to demonstrate how many parolees actually meet the SIV criteria, or how many were priority 1, 2, or 3 refugees applicants before being granted parole status. The Biden administration has an uphill battle to show the American people that the people paroled are not a security threat. Isolated incidents regarding alleged crimes by parolees don't help that perception. But the first step towards increasing the confidence is finally answering our very legitimate questions. In short, President Biden owes it to the people he was elected to serve to address these concerns without further delay. I'm pushing Congress to create a joint committee to examine Afghanistan and the effects that the disastrous withdrawal has caused. Mr. Joscelyn, given General Milley's sentiment that terrorist organizations will make a resurgence in the next couple of years, what do you see as the greatest vulnerability to America's security, and how do we prevent terrorists from exploiting it?
I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding, even in General Milley's comments about the resurgence of the terrorist threat in Afghanistan. I don't think that they really understood that al-Qaeda was marbled throughout the Taliban insurgency, was helping the Taliban win the war. Besides all the tactical things that I worry about in terms of plots that they can attempt, I think that what's been underestimated here is the degree to which their victory is a boon for the global jihadist movement. We've been tracking jihadist groups all across Africa, the Middle East, and in South Asia. I can show you more than 30 statements from these groups and other high-ranking individuals saying that they see the Taliban's victory as a sign that the divine will is with them to achieve victory now globally. This is a morale booster for anti-American terrorists in many places.
Thank you, Mr. Joscelyn. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Warnock from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this critically important hearing. The war in Afghanistan is America's longest war, and by its conclusion, 2 decades after it started, we were deploying men and women who weren't even alive when the conflict started. Although Afghanistan has been mentioned in this committee, in the context of terrorist financing and Iran sanctions, today is the first time since 2001 that the Senate Banking Committee has held a hearing specifically focused on Afghanistan. And so I'm grateful to Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Toomey for holding this hearing. One of the key components of U.S. strategic failure in the war was an inability to develop reliable and preferable options for Afghans to build an economy that's not based on illicit drugs or minerals that other foreign powers like China and India seek. Failure was also due to an inability to stem the widespread corruption that crippled the ability of the national government to govern effectively and build trust among the people. We saw that play out at the end, but it was a reality long before August 15th. Mr. Smith and Ms. Eckert, I would like to hear from you regarding each of, on this question, recognizing that the U.S. war effort was a whole of government endeavor, not just what's happening with soldiers on the battlefield, and knowing how critical Afghanistan's economic viability was to success and failure, what questions should this committee and Congress have been asking over the last 20 years? And what can we learn from this lack of oversight to prevent a similar blind spot from happening again elsewhere?
Thank you, Senator. If what we're asking is how could we have built a better system in the past 20 years, which I think is really the fundamental sort of question here, I think we can learn a lot from the military. And the failures of the Afghan military, which I understand stemmed in part from the U.S. trying to build a military in our image, as opposed to a military that the Afghans could actually sustain on their own. They built sort of structures, but not institutions. And I think that's true throughout the society. And so we built quite a lot of structures with respect to terrorism financing, banking systems, payment systems even in Afghanistan. But my concern is we haven't built the institutions. We haven't built with the foundations and with the roots that can be self-sustaining. And so I think that's the real question with respect to nation building. I don't think is the word we're using anymore, but really the building of societies, the assisting of societies. How do we make sure that we build something that's sustaining and not something that just has a structure on top of no foundations? So that's really, and I think that's throughout the system, and not just in the military, but the economic system, the humanitarian system, social system, and otherwise.
Thank you. Ms. Eckert? You're muted. Ms. Eckert, we can't hear you.
Excuse me, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And I agree with you that we really do need a serious assessment of the last 20 years of U.S. policy, not the last, 2 months of U.S. policy vis-a-vis Afghanistan. And in order to do that, I think we really seriously have to look at what we put in and why it went wrong or why it didn't achieve the goals that we wanted. I do think that Congress, through the Special SIGAR, Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, has done an enormous amount of research to follow what has happened to U.S. programs and international programs that we've tried to put in place. But as Adam said, the committee has oversight for a number of these financial programs, sanctions, et cetera. And it is something that too often, I believe, the Congress provides a general authority and doesn't do as much oversight on implementation. There are undoubtedly and very clearly we can see unintended consequences of some of these policies, some of these sanctions, et cetera. So I do think from a systemic perspective, I really do think we need to look forward using the example we're dealing with right now in terms of the humanitarian and economic crisis, and to try to retool our system so we don't have to go through these kind of emergency situations of authorizing humanitarian assistance. I think the committee has a big role on reestablishing the exemption that it put in 1977 in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which has been routinely waived. So I look forward to the committee undertaking some of these efforts, and thanks very much for your thoughtful question.
Well, thank you so much, and it's wonderful to talk to you about this on the first hearing on Afghanistan in this committee 20 years later. But these questions clearly are not centered around August 15, when Kabul fell to the Taliban, but the 7,264 days we had American soldiers on the ground engaged in war when many in this committee, frankly, were not paying much attention. Thank you all so much, and Ms. Farid, we're inspired by your courage and your service.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Warnock, for your thoughtful comments. This has been a comprehensive and useful survey of the issues facing the international community in Afghanistan, the looming economic and humanitarian crisis facing the people in that country under Taliban rule. I thank our witnesses for their assessments of the situation there, how the U.S. and our allies might usefully work to ensure the continued delivery of critical humanitarian and economic assistance to the people of Afghanistan, while denying to the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and other designated terrorist groups the use of or the ability to benefit from such funds. So thank you all. For senators who wish to submit questions, for the record, those questions are due 1 week from today, Thursday, October 12th. To the witnesses, you have, please, 45 days to respond to any questions. Thank you again. The hearing